Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Joe Fish Kay. I am Principal Research Scientist in the Emerging Technologies team, and today I have the pleasure of presenting to you Jenna Burrell. Jenna Burrell is Associate Professor at the School of Information at UC Berkeley, and she's someone whose work I've been following for 20 years now, which is sort of terrifying. What I particularly like about Jenna's work and why I asked her to come and give a talk here is that she both has a strong understanding of the technology, but also of the social situation within it works. Let's try that again. She both has a strong understanding of the technology and the social situation within which it works, and I think that's really crucial. In particular, her work right now on questions like algorithmic fairness are really in line with the work that we're doing at Mozilla and the work we're doing at the Foundation in particular. And I think it's really interesting to see how those have come together and how that has gone from being a sort of edge case topic to something that is like right there, that is sort of part of the discourse in culture in a really interesting way. So, without any further ado.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe Fish. My talk today concerns the way users of online platforms think about and engage with algorithms in this very explicit way, talking about attending to these things they call algorithms. And I'm especially looking at algorithms that shape content, the content users see. So these are sometimes called content curation algorithms. I think that there are lots of examples of that. So search engines they curate content, they order and rank it. Timeline, Twitter's timeline, I'll be talking about that today. The Facebook news feed, lots and lots of examples of content curation algorithms. But also content moderation algorithms. That's a little more tricky to talk about because content moderation is not always algorithmically handled. It's handled by humans, but there seems to be an algorithmic component to that as well. There is certainly a rising awareness among the general public, among internet users of algorithms. Some of that has to do with just an onslaught of mass media coverage that's using that term. There's scholarship, there's advocacy efforts. More and more of the internet using public, I think, has some notion of what an algorithm is and may even use that word. It was like 6 months ago, I was getting a haircut, and I was talking to my hairdresser about this talk I was going to go give at Virginia Tech, and I was explaining it in kind of, non-technical language, and she said to me, "Oh, you're talking about algorithms." I was like, that was a real moment of clarity for me. Some of it had to do with, she was very social media savvy. She was advertising herself on social media. She'd taken one of these marketing classes. So that's one example of how that word is being mainstreamed. Around this more public conversation about algorithms, there is a sense that there's some kind of problem with algorithms, particularly machine learning and AI algorithms. There's concern about the data that's being fed into those algorithms being skewed. There's concern that they're biased or unfair in some way. The algorithmic fairness discussion is related to that. In some really high stakes domains like criminal justice, there's discussion about racist algorithms. In particular, there's been a lot of conversation about recidivism risk algorithms, these functions that basically say whether an inmate or someone who's about to get parole is high risk for reoffending. And some research that has shown that, for example, black parolees are more likely to be mistakenly labeled as high risk than white parolees, for example. But also lots of other high-stakes domains, vetting job applicants, college admissions, lending, credit and lending. Those are all domains where these conversations are happening. And I think the scholarship broadly is AI ethics is the term that's kind of encompassing a lot of those issues. I have this hunch. I've been participating in the fairness debate for a while, for at least a few years now, and I had a hunch that some of the alarm was really not about fairness, which suggests if we redistribute things, everything will be hunky-dory and it'll all be fine. I had a hunch that it was more fundamentally about what it means for humans to be subject to automation, just that fundamental fact, which suggested that even if we kind of validate and prove a fair algorithm, it won't entirely erase some of the anxieties and problems that people attach to algorithmic decision making. And I was really interested in exploring instead matters of human autonomy, control, self-determination that seem to be somewhat less explored in the AI ethics discussion. And so that's what I set about with several of our fantastic PhD students at the iSchool to investigate. So there are many acronyms in this space. Here's ours. There's FAT, there's FATE, there's FACT. We're AFOG, the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group. A little sense of location. There's fog. There's the Berkeley campus in the foreground and the fog rolling in the background. If you're interested in what we're doing in this space, there's a website. We're the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Working Group, which, if you like Welsh, it kind of sounds like a Welsh word, AFOG, but we just kind of dropped the W, and it's a silent W, so we call it AFOG. We've been running AFOG for, I think we're in our third year. We're funded by Google. Thanks, Google. We are kind of just a small working group at this point with aspirations to grow larger. You can see in the acronym we've selected, we've highlighted two concerns. Control is not one of them, autonomy, self-determination. We picked, like everyone else, fairness and opacity or transparency. Those are some of the most common kind of values or concerns that are raised in this space of AI ethics. I think I want to just say, take a moment to kind of contemplate why it is that fairness has gotten so much attention, why that's really gotten traction above the many values and concerns we might be discussing in this space. I think in part it has to do with the fact that fairness is really amenable to formalism. And so you see the same people kind of designing the biased algorithms are now able to kind of weigh in and say, well, this is how we could correct it. So the algorithm makers have a role to play. They can, if we just precisely define fairness, then we can kind of analyze to what extent an algorithm is or is not fair. We can maybe find ways to correct it, and then we have good new algorithms that are more fair. So the problem of algorithms is solved with algorithms. I think also the fairness discussion has often focused on things like error rates, like the distribution of error rates. And that ties into accuracy. That's sort of in the world of machine learning and AI, accuracy is sort of the core concern of kind of properly functioning algorithms. So it just fits in well into the space that's already inhabited by people working in machine learning and AI. That's not a good reason to kind of leave it there. I think we should, as I'm arguing today, broaden beyond that kind of narrow focus on particular values that are easy to kind of grapple with. And control is the one I'm advocating for today. It's not one of these marquee values in the AI debate. And so with these PhD students of mine, we sort of weighed in to think, how can we start to grapple with questions of control? How can we find some kind of evidentiary basis to think about what it is, what it means to people using online platforms, and what value it might offer? Okay, so the outline, I've already sort of tackled one, which is suggesting that control has been sort of a deprioritized value in AI ethics. It's not absent, it's not one of those marquee values. I'm gonna now go on to talk about, with a particular case study, some evidence that users certainly do care about control, and in fact, they attempt to exert control in these really creative ways over algorithms. We used a data set of Twitter data, which I'll get into in another slide. And then I'm going to, after I talk about that study and what we found, I'm going to talk about, apart from just control being in and of itself an important thing, the kind of broader social utility that is created when users seize control of the algorithms. And I wanted to acknowledge my great collaborators on this project, the co-authors of a CSCW paper that I'm presenting in November. 3 PhD students, Zoe Kahn, Ann Jonas, and Daniel Griffin. Okay, so there is some literature about control. It's not necessarily in the AI ethics space, but I wanted to just kind of point to it to show where I'm coming from and how I'm doing something distinct from these prior literatures. I think the most compatible work tends to be in the law scholarship. It's often sort of buried in papers about AI ethics. So there's discussions about human autonomy, issues of self-determination, the right for decisions that are made to involve a human in the loop. So if you feel you've been mistreated by a automated decision, there's some form of recourse, there's a human you can appeal to. Again, that's certainly in the law scholarship. It tends not to be as central in the AI ethics literature. But it's there, and that is really where I'm aligning my work in this space, is to think about control as a value, as a kind of dignitary concern. There's literature that goes back to the 90s. There's sort of a recent revival around this idea of intelligence augmentation. I love that stuff. It's a great space to be working in. The idea is that machine learning and AI can produce all kinds of great new possibilities, but human ways of thinking, human cognition is a distinctly different thing, and it has its own strengths. And if you can combine machine intelligence and human intelligence, you have something even better, right? You have some kind of combination of talents and abilities. I think how I would distinguish my work in this space is that work tends to focus on cognition, and kind of the efficiency gains that can be realized by bringing together machines and humans. And that's just a different kind of argument than one that's really about control and human self-determination as a right or as a value. There is also I was realizing this last night that I had completely omitted the AI safety people, which, you know, some argue that's a little bit fringe, but it's this idea that we will have super intelligent machines and we need to have some kind of human oversight, a way for humans to kind of pull the plug and make sure that the machines don't, you know, develop an intelligence that leads to them killing us. Very famous proponents of this perspective, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking. At my university, Stuart Russell is talking a lot about this. There's the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford. So there's a control theme in there for sure. That's also not where I'm kind of aligning my work in this space. And then there's really interesting and ever richer literature on algorithmic gaming or strategic classification. I've just been reading more and more in that space. A professor at UC Berkeley in the computer science department, Moritz Hart, who I've been talking to, is doing a lot of work in this space. And that's, you know, a literature that acknowledges humans as attempting to exert control over algorithms and tries to kind of understand in what ways that control is legitimate or illegitimate. I mean, gaming generally, by definition, means kind of illegitimate control over some sort of algorithmic decision-making process. And I think it's worth just fleshing out a couple of definitions, because those seem the most kind of clear and easy to grapple with. Of gaming, control as gaming. So there's this piece by Moritz Hart, who I just mentioned, from a few years back, where he defines gaming as the harm is to the prediction accuracy of a classifier. It's gaming is something where users seize control in a way that gives them an unintended advantage, and, you know, the harm is to the accuracy of the classifier, the accuracy of the algorithm. To me, I think these definitions are useful, because if you have a nice clear definition like that, you can start to think about ways that control over algorithms might not be illegitimate, might be valid. So for example, in that definition, if you're manipulating an algorithm in such a way that it doesn't harm the accuracy or give you some unintended advantage, whatever that might mean, then that's control, but it's not necessarily gaming. And I think just kind of keeping space open to talk about control as a legitimate practice is really important, and I'm going to talk about that today. The other piece, this is a law scholarship article. This is probably the most relevant piece I was able to find that I could kind of link into. It's a piece by Bambauer and Zarsky. It's only a year old. It's called The Algorithm Game. I would definitely recommend it. It's very comprehensive, as law review articles often are. Their definition really rests on the idea that often what's being measured is not the thing you're interested in, but a proxy, right? So if you're trying to measure college readiness, you do like an essay, like a standardized test, right? And we all kind of can understand that, yeah, how well you do on the SAT is kind of related to how ready you are for college, but not exactly. And gaming is where you exploit the proxy. So if you get, this is recently in the news, if you get extra time to take the test, if you have someone take it for you, you're manipulating the proxy, the SAT score, and it's not actually reflective of the thing you're trying to measure, which is college readiness. Yeah, so then of course, if that's what gaming is, if you are actually changing your college readiness and you're getting a better score as a result of that, that's a way of exerting control over the scoring mechanism without gaming it. Okay, so moving on from some definition work. We were interested in control and from the beginning, self-determination, how people relate explicitly to algorithms. And then we thought, well, how do we find out more about that? How do we get some kind of evidence? What we ended up doing, I will say right up front that I was really interested in these kind of high stakes domains like criminal justice. So we went and we looked at like Twitter data. That's not quite the same domain, but it was a good place to start. I think it was a nice, modest way to kind of get started on some of these questions. We collected data over a 12-week period. This was actually almost exactly a year ago. And what we did was to collect all the tweets that referenced the Twitter algorithm and variants. So Twitter's algorithm, Twitter algorithms, right? But those two words in sequence. And we ended up with 8,875 tweets. They're pretty evenly, I mean, there wasn't a real concentration in particular accounts. So you can see that there are 8,041 accounts, user accounts, that produce those tweets, which I think was a good sign. Half of them about half were original tweets, about half were reply tweets. And I wanted to actually reference Kate Starbird's talk last week, because one thing I noticed and felt affirmed by was she was like, we spent a lot of time actually reading like thousands of tweets, like reading them by hand, and that's really what this project was. We didn't read all 8,875. We read a sample. We read, in the end, we read and tried to code 911 tweets between the four researchers on the project. So I'm glad to see that Kate agrees that's a valid way of doing this research. And I found it really illuminating to just sit and read tweet after tweet after tweet and see why are people invoking the Twitter algorithm? What are they trying to say? What are they trying to do? And that was really the question we started with. What are Twitter users doing when they invoke the algorithm? So to start, what we did with our 911, well, some small set of that, maybe 100, we were just trying to develop a set of codes inductively that would kind of thematically categorize those tweets, answering the question, what are Twitter users doing when they invoke the algorithm? Are they complaining about it? Are they trying to understand it better? And what we got out of that was a sense that there was a control theme for sure. We definitely found a subset of tweets within our sample that were about feeling like people feeling like they didn't have control over the algorithms or trying to exert control in the way they wrote tweets. That's what I'm going to spend most of my time kind of delving into. But this was our method. So our process, we took the subset of tweets. I said 911 tweets. The end data set was 718 because some of those tweets ended up being dead links. We actually went and followed the links for each tweet because we wanted to see the tweet in context. Thinking about kind of the ethics of it. If a tweet was deleted, if it was now in a protected account, if there are just ways that the author signaled that they didn't want it to be public, we removed it from our data set. And then some were just uninterpretable, like we just couldn't really understand what the person was saying. I mean, the nice thing about Twitter data is that people are generally writing for an imagined human mass public audience. So for the most part, we felt we could understand what people were trying to say in those tweets, but in some cases we really couldn't. Okay, so this is a subset of the 10 codes that we developed. There were 4 meta categories The first is kind of an explanation category, education explanation, so where people are trying to, they're talking about the Twitter algorithm in an effort to either find information about how it works or to share information about how they think it works. There were a set of complaints, 4 codes under the complaints category. That's not surprising. People talking about the Twitter algorithm to say it's doing something weird, it's doing something wrong, they don't like it. There was this meta category we called relationship management, which that sort of was the seed for an idea we developed further through the course of the project. The 2 tweets, I think, are good examples of relationship management. So people sometimes felt like they had to intervene. They saw Twitter as a platform for social interaction, for community building. Sometimes they felt they were undermined by the algorithm. It was connecting them to people that they're trying to explain why they aren't creepy, why they're responding to someone's tweet who they don't know, or if they had been ignoring someone because they hadn't been seeing their tweets, they would invoke the algorithm to explain why they hadn't been a better, friend on Twitter. So the first tweet reflects that kind of relationship management. This person says, I realize I haven't seen a Twitter friend tweet in a while, but I realize that might be because Twitter's algorithm hasn't been surfacing their tweets. So I do a search for their account, and sure enough, they've been tweeting good tweets I haven't been supporting. So you can see the sense of obligation to be a good Twitter friend. I mean, this tweet even uses the phrase Twitter friend, and the sense that there's some kind of act of support they should be carrying out that they haven't been doing. And then the second one, I deeply apologize, this person says, to anybody who's seen gay porn as a result of me liking it. Twitter algorithms are hard at work once again. So kind of making a joke to friends about the things that you like, that you support on Twitter, and then get exposed to your Twitter friends, and maybe you didn't intend for that to happen. So explaining and kind of trying to mollify any less than positive reactions your Twitter friends have to that. And that's an example of I didn't put all the codes, but one of the codes we called shifting blame from person to algorithm. That's an example. It's not my fault. It's the Twitter algorithm that's doing this. And then the final category, exerting control over algorithms, that's really where we spent a lot of time focusing our attention. The 2 color-coded ones are control-themed tweets. We did actually, so a few things to say. It was kind of a quasi-content analysis. We did actually look at the frequency of each of these codes. I am reluctant to kind of broadcast that. I don't think it's easy to misinterpret what that means. I think what we found just reading the tweets themselves was that people generally are writing about the algorithms in a moment where something is happening. So it's very much skewed towards the parts of the Twitter platform that are very visible, right? So the timeline, people complaining about the timeline, people commenting on the timeline. The frequency of these codes, I think, should not be interpreted to mean that these are kind of rankings of how much people care about each of these things. They're really more kind of what happens to people the most on the platform. And then I think, so I have an appendix slide if people really want to get into that. It is included, but I'm not going to go over the frequency of the codes. I think the control code was like between 10 and 20% of the tweets from our sample had a control theme. So that tells you there's something you can find in the data. It's not hard to find people talking about control. Among complaints, people sometimes complained that they felt the algorithm was dictating behavior to them. Often it was tied to complaints about censorship, like I'm being censored, I can't say things in the way I want to because the algorithms, and usually they were referring to what they thought were content moderation algorithms, prevent them from being free on the platform and the way they express themselves. Okay, so let's move on to talk about, I think what I wanted to start with before I dig into the control-themed tweets, I wanted to just kind of give you a sense of the gestalt of what, if you look at all those tweets together when people are talking about the Twitter algorithm, we started to get this emerging sense of what it is that people are doing on Twitter, what they seem to be doing. I think in a nutshell, it seemed like there was a real emphasis, especially in the tweets we were looking at, in community building. I'm calling it assembly work, which I'll get to later in the presentation. But community building is maybe a more accessible way to talk about it. And what was really interesting about that was it seemed to be contradicted by the way Twitter as a platform describes itself, if you look in their kind of help files. This was not a place where people were just going to consume engaging content, right? They were trying to build communities. And what they were doing algorithmically or in attending to and controlling the algorithms was pretty nuanced. It wasn't trying to manipulate the algorithms to get more attention. Sometimes it was, but it wasn't just that. Sometimes it was manipulating the algorithms to get less attention or to draw kind of boundaries around their communities, kind of self-protective boundaries. And I will talk about that in more depth, but I think that's the gist of what, on the whole, we saw with these control strategies. Community building, boundary drawing, some amount of kind of attention seeking, but it wasn't just gaming the algorithm to get more attention on the platform. I want to talk about, so I've talked about people talking about Twitter algorithms. I haven't mentioned, like, what are those Twitter algorithms? What do they mean by it? What do I mean by it? There's some pretty clear-cut examples. I mean, the timeline is a very straightforward one. The timeline doesn't show you a chronological list of everyone you follow. It's curated by Twitter in some way that is not totally clear to users. So that many of the users whose tweets we looked at would call the timeline algorithm. I talked to some Twitter people the other day. There's not like one algorithm, so it's a bunch of algorithms. But as a concept, I think it makes sense more or less to think of it as the timeline algorithm. There's also, these recommendation algorithms. There's the who to follow box that suggests people for you to follow. People would hone in on that as a Twitter algorithm. There's the ads that it serves you. People would point to that as a Twitter algorithm. And I think the content moderation side of things is where I'm really unclear about to what extent that's automated or to what extent it makes sense to call that an algorithm or something that is done algorithmically, but certainly Twitter users thought that part of the platform was done algorithmically. So we're kind of working between perceptions and reality, mostly staying on the side of perceptions, because I'm just looking at what users identify as algorithms and what they, what they're seeking to control. A couple other things I want to say about Twitter, just to kind of distinguish it from other platforms. I mean, certainly I think this project, it became very Twitter specific because of the data we had, but I would like to kind of think more broadly to other online platforms and then go offline and think about other domains, like I mentioned, criminal justice, in similar terms in terms of control. A couple of things that I think is just helpful to remind ourselves about with Twitter. It's ad supported, yes, of course. It's very public compared to, say, Facebook. Twitter's much more public. The assumption is that you tweet for a unknown invisible audience. It's driven by user-generated content, as are many other platforms. There's lots of encounters between strangers on that platform. You're followed continually by people you've never met. It's not like Facebook that way. There's no emphasis on following or being followed by people you know in real life. There's no real names policy, so there are lots of pseudonymous accounts. I mean, you can probably see where I'm going with that. That's generated lots of problems on that platform, in part related to kind of mob harassment. But those are some of the qualities of the platform to keep in mind. I think that I would draw a distinction certainly to YouTube. So people aren't on Twitter very explicitly monetizing themselves in the way you see on YouTube. So I think on YouTube you probably see a lot, if I was going to guess, I would expect a lot more strategies around maximizing attention on YouTube, and maybe less so on Twitter, because there's money on the line on YouTube, whereas there's not direct kind of monetization on Twitter. Okay, so that's a little bit just to kind of keep in mind what's specific and unique and interesting and characteristic of Twitter. let's talk about control strategies. So I'm going to talk about 3 kind of major strategies of exerting control. That's that last code in my list from, I'll just kind of take us back there, just looking at what we found in this category, where people were not just talking about control, but trying to use the platform to exert control over Twitter algorithms, whatever they thought those algorithms might be. And that, I think, was a surprise. We expected to see people talking about it. I don't think we realized in advance that there'd be so much work to invoke the algorithms in the course of trying to do something to them, trying to affect some outcome through them. So one category of commentary about controlling the algorithms was about personalization. So a couple of ways that surfaced. People trying to, I'm going to go with the second bullet point first. I described it as disrupt the construction of a data double. So trying to undermine the platform's efforts to collect data and to know who they are and to kind of develop a coherent, accurate data profile. There were people who talked about ways to game the Twitter algorithm to disrupt that, to not be known by the algorithm. The second tweet is more to that point than the first. So this person says, I decided to investigate what Twitter algorithms think of me. I haven't checked before on this account. Damn, whatever I'm doing right, as it's all over the place. So that, I have to give a little context. That's in reference to, there's a kind of a configuration screen on Twitter that shows you your interests. It's this list of things that Twitter thinks it knows about you. This person apparently checked that list and was like, wow, that's so inaccurate. That just covers so many different interests or things that Twitter thinks it knows about me, which are just wrong, and I like it. I like that. I like that I've evaded Twitter as a platform, their attempts to kind of develop a data profile about me. And there's a whole book about this, Obfuscation, by Helen Niesenbaum and Finn Brunton. If you're interested in that topic, lots more to read about that. But I see that this isn't the only example of that. I saw that in a certain pattern among the tweets that talked about control as having to do with things like privacy or working against personalization or trying not to be profiled. The other example of that was where people, on the whole, people seem to be very invested in being understood by the algorithm. So having their content personalized and being shown ads that speak to them. And even among the complaints, people offended because Twitter seems to think they're like a person who'd be interested in a Rolex watch, and that's just so not true about them, right? So more often we saw complaints that the platform wasn't personalized enough or didn't fully understand them. But there were some other tweets about the algorithm that had to do with trying to get outside of that filter bubble, trying to get content that wasn't exactly reflective of who they were or who their interests were or who their opinions were. So I've labeled that escaping the filter bubble. Yes, so this is very kind of individualistic. So this is things that people are doing alone to try and configure their account in a way that they consider preferable. And I think what this reflects is that there's not one way in which there's kind of dominant themes in what Twitter users want. Generally, they want to have personalized content. But there are, of course, human variety is vast. People who don't want that kind of personalization, who don't want to be seen or understood by the platform, and who don't want to be fed content that's kind of catering to their existing interests and identity. Okay, another category of control strategies I'm describing as overcoming the platform's errors. Those could be things like content moderation errors. These are probably things that won't be surprising to you at all. Often it's about misreading sentiment, missing the nuance in tweet contents. I think the first one, tweet is one of my favorites. So, pro tip, since Twitter's algorithm is being hyper-aggressive with suspending accounts that use the word kill, sarcastically, I suggest we switch to the word kale. And then there's an example. I swear to God, Janet, if you don't shut up, I will kale. Kale me now honestly, in my mind, it's more terrifying. So a kind of strategy of swapping in one word for another, it's agreed upon by the people in that community that we use the word kale instead of kill, and then that way we avoid this mistake that whatever content moderation process is undertaken makes, in seeing that word kill and not understanding that it's not explicitly part of an attempt to threaten someone. And I think, you can see that on many online platforms. This is a real challenge. Human expressive behavior is so nuanced, so vast, so varied, that to the extent it's being tackled through automated systems, it makes mistakes all the time. Problems of misunderstanding, like common sense problems, but problems that certainly are true of automated kind of detection systems. And I just will put it out there, maybe you know more than I do, but it seems to me that automated systems that can decode the nuance within the universe of human creative expression are a pretty long way off, right? So that's going to continue to be a challenge on platforms that try to either curate content or moderate content. And so the workaround, which I think is, probably an encouraging thing to see, is people picking up on ways in which the platform is misunderstanding what they're saying and trying to develop ways to avoid those problems themselves, kind of correct for the errors. Another problem that was often brought up, which I think Twitter has a new policy that maybe is addressing this. People would engage with a politician or a political figure whose views they were very much opposed to. And they would engage with those views to criticize them or reject them. They would do it through a retweet or a reply. And then later on, they would see that same figure recommended to them as someone to follow. And that certainly picked up on people's sense of being misunderstood by the platform. Like, I don't know if Twitter's using sentiment analysis or if this is just beyond sentiment analysis. Generally, people who despise certain politicians don't also want to follow them. Sometimes maybe they do, but generally they don't. So that was often read by users as an error. Like, clearly the platform doesn't understand that I am critiquing this person, not following and celebrating them. And it also tapped into concerns people had about engagement, the kind of logic of engagement on the platform, that engagement, even when it was negative engagement, was rewarded on the platform and amplified. And so there were workarounds that had to do with people trying to, which I will talk about in the next slide, people trying to avoid rewarding people who they didn't support with engagement and using the platform to avoid indicating engagement. Okay, so this is the kind of summative strategy of control that I think captures most what we're trying to contribute to the discussion about control. So I said in a few slides back when I was talking about what Twitter users are doing on Twitter, I talked about community building. I am also calling this assembly work. There's a piece in a law review, journal Cornell Law Review, from a few years back, titled Virtual Assembly, which references the not freedom of speech, but freedom of assembly in the US Constitution, kind of a clause that's lesser recognized and is not about the freedom to express ideas of any sort, but about the freedom to come together with other people. And I think what's really interesting about what we saw in the control strategies of people on Twitter was that they were basically trying to assemble. They're trying to curate communities, trying to come together with other people. It was, social media. It was a very social practice. It wasn't just about consuming or producing content. It was about relationship management. It was about community building. It was about doing assembly work. And often the way the platform worked undermined those. The algorithms, like the timeline algorithm, undermined those efforts. And people had to develop some very creative ways to be able to do that assembly work, to say who was in their community, to set boundaries. Often that was about avoiding relentless harassment. Not to just be algorithmically recognizable, not to tap into engagement, not to be gain more and more attention on the platform, but to avoid certain kinds of unwanted attention from certain groups. And that, I talked about on this slide, enacting community boundaries. So let me give some examples of what that means. Like, what are some examples of that? There is a piece by Emily Vandernagel about, she talks about, she uses the term Voldemorting. I mean, so that's a good one. There's also, people talk about subtweeting. That's probably one that more people know about. So subtweeting, you're talking about something, you're talking about someone, but you very purposefully don't at them. You don't use their account name in talking about them because you don't want to draw their attention, and maybe more importantly, you don't want to draw the attention of their followers. So the Gamergate thing, the issue, controversy of a few years ago was an example where a kind of code words were used by people who were trying to avoid being targeted by the Gamergate community. They would use the word Goobergate or Gamergate with an @ symbol. They'd use these kind of subtweet-like code words as a way to communicate within their sub-community and avoid attention, draw boundaries and avoid attention from groups they felt were likely to harass them. So that's an example of how that's enacted as control on the platform itself. The first tweet is super interesting. So there was a set of tweets that were, in our data set, there was one person who tweeted 25 times, sort of the most of any individual account, and tweeted almost the same exact thing. I don't think this was the exact tweet, but it was very similar. So this is someone replying to a journalist and saying, cheers, Adam. It's the advantages they get from the Twitter algorithm that most concerns us in the disinformation combat community. So there's a community that's being labeled, the disinformation combat community. This reply is, so basically this journalist tweeted about something, retweeted a politician, added their account name in the tweet, and this person's trying to kind of correct their behavior and say, don't do that. If you want to talk about a politician, if you want to talk about a political idea that you oppose, don't retweet, don't like, don't reply, use a screenshot. And actually this became a hashtag use screenshots. So you can engage with ideas without feeding into that engagement mechanism by copying it, using that screenshot in your tweet and avoiding all of the kind of engagement, the way that taps into the way the Twitter platform rewards engagement. This tweet is so interesting. It's on so many levels. I think one is that this was clearly a kind of effort by this person to spread a best practice. I mean, he kept tweeting at people, encouraging them to use screenshots. And this hashtag, if you search on the use screenshots hashtag, there's lots of examples still. And this shows you kind of collaborative efforts within a community. This person identifies himself as the part of the disinformation combat community, and advocating for a certain best practice around making Twitter a better place with less misinformation. So certainly some examples in this space were attention seeking. So I've talked a bit about people trying to be less recognizable or invisible on the platform as a way to kind of defend and create boundaries around a community they're building on Twitter. EXO Global, does that mean anything to anyone? It's one of the very popular Korean boy bands. So this is part of fan Twitter. There was a whole set of tweets that talked about the algorithm, the Twitter algorithm, related to, I call it a campaign among fans of this boy band to get their band to trend on the Twitter trends. So that's certainly kind of a classic example of trying to game the algorithm to maximize its attentional resources, right? To kind of get as much attention for something you're in support of, in this case, a Korean boy band. And I think this is also, though, a really good example of community building or assembly work. So this is a group that identifies itself as a fan group, fans of EXO Global, coming together for a very kind of short-term campaign to get attention for this and support for this band that they are really passionate about. Okay. All right, am I aiming for like 45 minutes or so?
We've got 15 minutes left that you can split between
Okay.
finishing up and answering questions.
Okay, all right, I'm closing in on the end. Okay, so I said I would talk about, as the kind of third bullet point in my outline, this idea that algorithmic control strategies have social utility. And I hope that's sort of been clear from what I've described so far, this kind of community building work, working around platform errors. What I would say, kind of just to summarize that, I mean, the point here is that we can talk about control inherently as a value or a right. Like, it's just a matter of self-determination, and as much as possible, it makes sense to allow users control on the platforms that they use that matter to them. But I think what's interesting here is you can see how that control strategy turns over into supporting other kinds of values on the platform, including community building and assembly work, right? So there's another value. This law review article talks about the value of assembling online. So control as a value feeds into supporting other kinds of values on the platform. So in sum, I would say about what Twitter users are doing when they exert control is they're drawing boundaries around the communities that they're building to protect them from abuse and harassment. There's a real social utility there. They are seeking to resist the platform's relentless push towards engagement when they don't want to fuel that. They're using it to work around algorithmic errors, such as problems in reading sentiment. Other users are resisting being known by the algorithm in a principled stance of resistance to the platform's logic of surveillance, and they're doing that by engaging in personal data obfuscation. So those are some of the reasonable strategies of users who, they may be diverging from the goals of the platform itself. They're customizing it to their own needs and interests, and they're expressing, in a way, personal views that diverge from the platform's goals. So I think those are some pretty clear examples of social utility. And I think to kind of summarize that point, it appears that people really need to know how the algorithms function in order to do this work of managing how and with whom they assemble on platforms like Twitter. Like, it's pretty necessary. And because those algorithms operate as background processes, the ways users interact with them are really pretty indirect, right? And I'd have to talk some more to the people at Twitter to understand whether it seems like they're being discouraged from interacting with those algorithms, right? They're expected to just behave in these kind of natural, uncoordinated ways, and that's how the algorithms are designed to kind of read behavior. There actually was thinking, if we're talking about assembly work or people assembling online, I was trying to think of some offline examples that might sort of reflect the struggles people have with trying to understand how these algorithms work and turn them to their own purposes. So if you could think of a public place with a gate and the schedule isn't posted, but there's kind of an underlying pattern about when you can enter the space, but it's purposefully obfuscated, right? That's sort of an example of how people experience these algorithms. It's like sometimes you can come in, sometimes you can get attention, sometimes you can have a platform to announce something, sometimes you can't. If you really work hard, you can figure out maybe what the pattern is there. Or another example might be if you sent out an invitation to an event to a list of 100 people, and some random subset of maybe 20 actually got your invitation. I think that's another example that's pretty approximate. It's sort of like when you post something on your timeline, some people see it and some people don't. It depends on whether it's placed on their timeline, whether they're on Twitter, right? So there's a certain kind of difficult randomness that people really struggle with in trying to use this platform and many others as a place to assemble when it's so obfuscated. Okay, so what do we do about it? I'm just going to go through this briefly. I really like this piece by Jonathan Gruden from, it's a little old, 2009. He sort of tracks this pattern between like the rise of AI, like as AI rises, HCI falls, and as HCI rises, AI is falling. I think he's arguing in this paper that maybe it won't continue this way, but I do think in this case, around the debate on AI ethics, the field of HCI, human-computer interaction, really has a lot to contribute, and I think we're gradually starting to see that as these criticisms of AI emerge there's a really important role to play, certainly around things like user control. HCI has a really important place. So things that might support user control, it's not just about design, technology design. There are existing examples where control seems to be part of the thinking. So the GDPR has this right to explanation clause, which partly is about people not being just subject to automated decisions that they have no way of understanding, appealing, right? So that there's a bit of a control element, an autonomy goal underlying the right to explanation. And this isn't just a new thing. So if you look at credit scoring, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act has this is from the 1970s. GDPR obviously is EU, ECOA is US, but there's this adverse action notice if you apply for a loan and you're denied the loan, by law you have to be told why. And there's sort of a list of 20 reasons that's not, it doesn't have to be one of those, but generally lenders use one of those 20 reasons to explain to you why you didn't get the loan. And the idea there, of course, in part is that now that you know, you can correct for that. You can do something to make yourself more creditworthy in the future, which obviously is it's trying to support control. Site policies. So in 2018, Facebook kind of increased the transparency of their content moderation process. They added an appeals process and promised that if you appeal a content moderation decision, a human will look at it, which I thought was really interesting. And then there's a lot of work kind of emerging in the interaction design space. I cited 3 things that if you're looking for more, these are 3 good ones to start with. There's Wendy Ju's piece from 2008 on implicit interaction, which I really like. That's not super new, but if we're talking about background processes that don't present themselves to users, how do you think about design when that's operating in your systems? Paper, and I can't remember which ACM conference, but a paper called Guidelines for Human AI Interaction that had lots of good tips and suggestions. And then I think it was a Medium article. Yeah, Medium article by Josh Lovejoy called Human-Centered AI Cheat Sheet. So there, if this is interesting to you and you're thinking about design, those are places you could go read more. So conclusion, reasons to cede control to platform users. They use it in these, not always, but they often use it in these productive ways. So working around algorithmic errors. Users on massively scaled platforms like Twitter, users see things that the platform can't, right? So empowering people to address the problems or issues they encounter it seems obviously a good idea. The law review article I mentioned at the beginning on algorithmic gaming, they talk about the creativity of control and even gaming, even the things that might be labeled illegitimate. They can spur innovations that allow the designer and its users to find novel uses for existing platforms. I also want to just put in a push here to say, if we're not thinking long and hard about granting control, are we expecting platforms like Twitter to handle all of these issues? And do we really want platforms run by private companies to be more autocratic as they continue to function as a de facto public sphere, right? That's an important question. There is a debate about control that centers on not burdening people with, having to take on the duty of managing platforms and their experience of platforms on their own without a lot of knowledge or understanding about how they work. And that's a great argument. The counter argument is if we don't invest that kind of control in users, empower them in certain ways, are we then saying, well, private companies are going to just handle it? It's obviously hard to handle, as we've seen. And then just the fundamental argument is that control supports, it's a dignitary concern. It supports human dignity. And that in and of itself maybe doesn't require further justification. The piece is available online right now. There's a shortened link if you want to go take a look at it. The paper's titled, When Users Control the Algorithms. I'm presenting it at the CSCW conference in November. And I think that's it. I'm happy to take any questions. And I am going to present this at Twitter in the next month or two.
Oh, that'll be fun.
Yeah.
So Twitter is sort of this interesting player here, because in some ways, I love the framing that you've done, and I love your organizational work here. And framing what people are doing as virtual assembly work is a very positive take on what you have otherwise characterized as resisting relentless harassment.
Yeah.
Right?
So the harassers are doing assembly work, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because they're doing assembly work too. I mean, and in a world in which Twitter, and I'm going to come out and say this, had responsible policies to actually address harassment in the way that one might expect a company with an increasing private-public commitment to actually do.
Yeah.
If they did their fucking job, right, would this still be necessary, right? Would we see the same pattern?
Yeah, so that law review article, I mean, that's the essential question, and I'm glad you brought it up so we can kind of tangle with the, it's a very not black and white issue. And I am, on that level, I'm a little uncomfortable in making this kind of one-sided argument that control is great and people need more control. So the law review article I referenced, the virtual assembly article, talks about these, I think he calls them expressive acts, these 4 expressive acts where people basically say, here's this community, here's who gets to join this community, here are the things we do as a community. People, I mean, expulsion is one of those expressive acts. People can be expelled from the community. If harassment was in check, I think there's still absolutely a value in people being able to say, this community is about this topic, and we're talking about, for example, feminism in this way, and we don't want a lot of newbies who are going to ask the same tedious questions and burden our time. It's not necessarily harassment, right? It's just about the way the community identifies itself. So it is absolutely great for Twitter to do much more than it's doing to tackle harassment, but I think this need to support control remains even when that's been checked, and when the wonderful day when the online harassment problem is in check.
Yeah. Cool. One plug, by the way, we have we, writ large, have an exhibition on Market Street right now called The Glass Room, which is all about issues of surveillance and things like this. And oh my God, you should totally go and check it out because it'll make you so happy. Well, or deeply distressed, or both of those. Do I have questions in the room?
Thanks for the talk. I found it really interesting, especially the takeaways on the social utility of algorithmic control. But to poke at it a little bit, do people feel that they have more control through these strategies? Do they feel that the virtual assembly work has been successful? And if they don't, does that undermine a little bit the argument that they have control, that they have exerted some control over the algorithm?
Yeah, I mean, I probably haven't been totally clear in how I'm taking these examples of exerting control, because I don't have a lot of evidence that any of those strategies are working very well. And I don't have a lot of evidence that the people using those strategies feel that they're working very well. And that would be a great kind of next step for this project. What I've shown is that there's a desire for control, and that people have these strategies that they think do or could work. And I think some of those strategies don't work at all. But that's the question. And I think what's missing is, because these algorithmic processes are treated as this, it's just this background thing that Twitter handles, and you just behave the way you normally would, and Twitter will handle it. They don't tell you how it works. I mean, I actually have this great slide. I'm glad I have an excuse to show it. This is how Twitter describes their timeline. It's super vague. Top tweets are the ones you're likely to care about most. They're based on accounts you interact with, tweets you engage with, and much more. Okay, that's, I mean, the accounts you interact with, tweets you engage with, that tells you a little bit of something. And our goal is to show you content that you're interested in, that contributes to the conversation, that's relevant, credible, and safe. Right? So that's a general information about how it works, which really tells you very little about what you might do to change it or to bend it to your interests. There's much more that could be done in this space, I think. If you're interested in users engaging with your algorithms, if you're not trying to hide them, if you're not trying to obfuscate how they work, there's a lot more you could tell people so that they're empowered to do something with their community building on the platform. So that's really where I'm pointing to, is like, what would it mean to be more transparent, to not treat algorithms as something that people shouldn't pay attention to, but as something they will pay attention to and will try to control, and how can you help them do it in a way that will serve their interests?
I know I have a bunch more questions for you, but we've got some time to chat. Please join me in thanking Jenna very much for her talk.